The morning Laurel Danes rode into Crossfield, Alberta. She had $14 in her coat pocket, a suitcase held shut with a leather belt, and a daughter who hadn't stopped coughing since Lethbridge. She hadn't planned to stop in Crossfield. She'd planned to keep going north to her cousin's place outside Red Deer, but the truck she'd hitched a ride with pulled over at the Petro-Canada on the edge of town, and the driver said, "Sorry, this is as far as I go." And Laurel stood on the gravel shoulder with the wind coming off the Rockies, cold and flat, and she thought, well, this is where we are then. She was 27 years old. Her daughter, Wren, was 4. They had been on the road for 6 days. The rancher's name was Malcolm Storey. She found out about him the way you find out about most things in a small Alberta town. She asked the woman at the gas station if there was anyone hiring, and the woman, whose name was Bev, looked her up and down with the kind of look that wasn't unkind but wasn't warm either, and said, "Malcolm Storey out on the Foothills Road took on a cook last spring and it didn't work out. Might be worth asking." Laurel asked how far the Foothills Road was. Bev said far enough. "You got a car?" Laurel said she didn't. Bev said she'd call her nephew to drive her out. That was how things worked in Crossfield. Not warmly, not coldly. Practically. People helped because it was practical to help. Laurel had grown up in Halifax and she'd spent 2 years in Vancouver, and she wasn't used to practical kindness. She'd been used to kindness that came with strings, or unkindness that came with apologies, and neither one had served her well. Bev's nephew, a kid named Travis who couldn't have been more than 19, drove them out to the Storey property in a rusted Silverado with a dream catcher hanging from the mirror and a Tim Hortons cup in every cup holder. Wren fell asleep against Laurel's arm before they even cleared town. The ranch was bigger than Laurel had expected. She'd expected something modest, a few acres and a tired fence line. What she got was land that went on until it hit the foothills and then climbed them, golden brown pasture broken by stands of aspen that had already gone to their fall color, and a main house that was old but solid, white paint worn to gray at the corners, a porch that ran the full length of the front. Travis said, "He's probably in the barn," and nodded his head toward a structure behind the house. He didn't get out of the truck. He waited. Laurel got out. She carried Wren against her shoulder, still sleeping, and walked to the barn. Malcolm Storey was 41 years old, and he looked it in the way that men who work outside look their age. Not worn out, just settled. He had the kind of face that had made peace with the weather a long time ago. He was running a brush along the neck of a bay mare when Laurel came through the barn door, and he didn't turn around right away. He finished the stroke he was doing before he turned. He looked at her. He looked at Wren. He said, "You're not from here." Laurel said no. Halifax originally. He said, "Long way." She said, "Yes." He went back to the horse. He said, "I had a cook. Didn't work out." Laurel said she'd heard that. He said, "I don't need somebody who's going to be gone in a month." She said she wasn't planning on going anywhere. He looked at her again. Really looked this time. At the suitcase held shut with a belt. At the sleeping child. At her coat, which was too light for Alberta in September, and probably too light for anywhere in October. He said, "I've got a room off the kitchen. It's small. There's a cot in there. She can sleep on the cot." Laurel said that would be fine. He said, "I don't pay much." She said she wasn't asking for much. He turned back to the horse. He said, "Supper's at 6. That was the whole interview. She cooked him pot roast that first night because it was what she had to work with. There was a chuck roast in the freezer and root vegetables soft enough to be going on too long in the cold cellar, and she made do. She set the table, and she fed Wren early at the kitchen counter, and she had the pot roast on, and the table set by 5 to 6. Malcolm came in at 6 exactly. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink. He sat down, he ate. He said thank you. When he was done, he didn't say anything else. She cleared the table. She washed the dishes. She put Wren to bed in the small room off the kitchen, the child already half asleep again, still coughing, and Laurel sat on the edge of the cot in the dark and listened to her breathe and thought about what she'd gotten herself into. She'd left Halifax because of a man she'd rather not name anymore, not even in her own head. She'd spent 4 years trying to make something work that couldn't be made to work, and she'd spent the last one of those years being afraid. And then one Tuesday in March, while Wren was at her mother's for the afternoon, Laurel had packed what she could carry, and she'd left. She'd told herself she was going to her cousin's in Red Deer. She'd told herself it was temporary. Sitting in the dark in a room off a stranger's kitchen in Crossfield, Alberta, she thought maybe nothing was temporary if you didn't let it be. The first week was quiet. Malcolm rose before dawn. She heard him on the stairs. She was a light sleeper, had become one over the past year, and she'd get up and have coffee made by the time he came through the kitchen. He never asked her to do this. She did it because it was something she could do, one small useful thing in a life where she'd been feeling useless for a long time. He'd take his coffee. He'd say morning. He'd go out. In the mornings, while Wren played on the kitchen floor with the small collection of wooden animals that Laurel had packed, a horse, a bear, a rabbit, a dog. Laurel cleaned the house, which hadn't been cleaned properly in some time. She didn't say this. She just cleaned. In the afternoons, she found the kitchen garden behind the house, mostly gone to frost now, a few sad kale plants hanging on, a row of carrots that hadn't been pulled. She pulled the carrots. She thought she might plant garlic before the ground froze hard. The third day, Malcolm came around the side of the house and found her on her knees in the garden, and he stopped. He said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know." He said, "The last woman who worked here didn't go near the garden." Laurel said, "Well, there are carrots that need pulling." He stood there a moment longer. Then he went back the way he'd come. Wren's cough didn't get better that first week. It was one of those chest coughs that settled in and didn't want to leave, and Laurel gave her the children's syrup she'd brought from Halifax and kept her warm and told herself it would pass. It was Malcolm who mentioned the doctor. He came in for supper Thursday of that first week, and he heard Wren coughing in the back room, and he sat down at the table and he said, "There's a clinic in town. Dr. Hartley. She's good." Laurel said she was sure it was just a cold. He said, "Could be. Still worth checking." He didn't push it. He ate his supper, but the next morning, Friday, there was a note on the kitchen table when Laurel came down. The note had an address and a time, 10:30 a.m., and it said, "I called ahead." Her name's on the list. Laurel stood at that kitchen table for a long time with the note in her hand. She thought about the last person who'd done something like that for her, who'd arranged something quietly on her behalf without being asked, without wanting credit for it. She couldn't remember anyone. She thought maybe she'd never had that before and just hadn't realized it until now, standing in a stranger's kitchen in Alberta at 6 in the morning with a note in her hand. She took Wren to the clinic. It was a chest infection, not serious, easily treated. She filled the prescription at the pharmacy with money she didn't really have, and she told herself she'd figure it out. When she got back to the ranch, there was a $20 bill folded under the sugar bowl on the kitchen counter. No note this time. The second week, she learned things about Malcolm's story. She learned that he took his coffee black and his tea with milk, never sugar. She learned that he didn't watch television, that he read in the evenings, thick paperback westerns, history books, the occasional biography, and that he left the books spine up, open, on the arm of the chair. She learned that he had been married, because there were photographs in the hallway, a younger Malcolm with a dark-haired woman who smiled like she meant it, and no one had said anything about her, and Laurel didn't ask. She learned that he had a temper, though not with people. On the Thursday of the second week, she heard him from inside the house, heard the sharp crack of something hitting the fence post, and she looked out the window and saw him standing in the yard with his hat in his hand, staring at the ground. Something had gone wrong with the cattle, she found out later. A calf had died, preventably, and Malcolm had caught it too late. He stood in the yard for 10 minutes without moving. Then he picked up his hat and went back to work. She learned that he talked to the horses. Not in baby talk, not the way people sometimes did with animals. He talked to them like they were reasonable beings who could help him think through a problem. She heard him once, through the barn wall, explaining to the bay mare why the irrigation system needed replacing and what he thought the best approach might be. He spoke slowly. He gave the mare time to respond, as if he expected her to. She didn't laugh at this. She thought it was one of the truest things she'd ever seen. It was in the third week that she started praying. She hadn't prayed since she was a girl, since her grandmother's house in Cape Breton, where prayer was as ordinary as breakfast. She'd left it behind somewhere in her 20s, along with other things she'd thought she'd outgrown. But Crossfield, Alberta, in October will do things to you. The sky at night was a thing she hadn't been prepared for. No city light for miles. The stars so thick and close she felt, some nights, that she was looking at the inside of something rather than the outside of it. She'd started going out to the porch after Wren was in bed, after the house was quiet, after she'd heard Malcolm's light click off down the hall. She'd sit in the old wooden chair at the end of the porch, and she'd pull her coat tight, and she'd look at that sky and she'd start talking. Not loud. Barely a whisper. Just her and the dark and whatever was listening. She prayed for Wren, that the cough would stay gone, that the wooden animals on the kitchen floor would be enough for now, that Wren would grow up and have more than a suitcase held shut with a belt, that she'd inherit something other than her mother's talent for choosing the wrong road and walking it long past the point of turning back. She prayed, sometimes, for herself. These were harder prayers, less certain. She asked for things she couldn't quite name. Not safety exactly, not happiness exactly, something more like ground, like a place to stand. She never prayed for Malcolm. She thought that wasn't her place. But she thought about him. She thought about the photographs in the hallway, the dark-haired woman. She thought about what it cost a person to be as closed as he was, to have walled something off so completely that even the shape of the room was gone. She sat on that porch in the dark and she whispered. And she thought no one heard her. She was wrong. Malcolm's bedroom was at the front of the house. His window was single pane, old glass, and sounds carried through it, the way sounds carry through old glass. Thin, slightly distorted, but present. He'd lain awake on the first night he heard her, staring at the ceiling, not sure what he was hearing. The second night he understood. He didn't go to the window. He didn't move at all. He lay still and he listened to her voice, too low to make out the words, just the rhythm and the shape of them, and he felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't expected. He'd had people in this house before. The woman who'd cooked for him the spring before had been pleasant and capable and gone in 6 weeks to follow a man to Medicine Hat. Before her, a series of seasonal workers, young men who came and went with the cattle seasons, who ate his food and did their work and left nothing behind. He'd grown used to people being temporary. He'd made his peace with it, or thought he had. This was different. He couldn't have explained why. He thought it had something to do with the carrots, with the way she'd been on her knees in the garden without being asked, pulling carrots that nobody had asked her to pull, with the way she'd put coffee on in the morning without a word about it, with the note he'd left for the clinic and how she'd come back and not said anything, had just made him a better supper than usual. He lay in the dark and listened to her pray, and he thought, this woman is carrying something heavy. He thought, she's been carrying it alone for a long time. He thought, that's not right. He didn't do anything about that thought. Not yet. But it settled in him and stayed. In the 4th week, she planted garlic. She'd ordered the seed garlic from the co-op in town, paid for it herself from her first week's wages, and she planted it in the garden in rows, deep enough to winter over, mulched with straw from the barn. It was a thing that wouldn't be ready until July. July was 9 months away. She was making a claim on July without knowing if July was going to happen, without knowing if she'd still be here. Malcolm found her doing it on a Saturday afternoon. He stood at the edge of the garden with his hands in his pockets. He said, garlic. She said, it needs to go in before the ground freezes. He said, that's a long bet. She kept working. She said, I know. He stood there a while. Then he went to the barn and came back with a better garden fork than the one she'd been using, and he handed it to her without a word and went back to the barn. November came. The cold came with it, the real cold, the kind that got into the bones of the old house and sat there. Laurel started wearing her coat indoors in the mornings until the wood stove had been going an hour. Malcolm noticed. She could tell by the way he started stoking the stove before she came down, so that by 6 there was already heat in the kitchen. He didn't say he'd done this. She didn't say she noticed. Wren had recovered from the chest infection and taken up a new habit of following Malcolm around the yard in the mornings. Laurel watched this from the kitchen window and felt something complicated. The child had never had this. A person who moved steadily, who did the same things at the same times, who was where he said he'd be. Malcolm, for his part, didn't seem to mind. He adjusted his pace without being asked. He explained things to her. He showed her how to hold out her hand flat for the horse. One morning, Wren came back inside and said, Malcolm says horses can tell if you're scared. Laurel said, Malcolm's right. Wren said, I wasn't scared. Laurel said, I know you weren't. Wren said, I don't think he's scared of anything. Laurel thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about the photographs in the hall. She thought about the calf that died in October, Malcolm standing in the yard with his hat in his hand for 10 minutes not moving. She thought about a person who could be afraid of things and not let it change their pace. She thought, actually, he might be afraid of quite a lot. He just decided not to let it run him. She called her cousin in Red Deer in November. Louise, who'd been expecting her since April, who'd been patient and hadn't pushed and had sent 2 texts a month asking if she was all right. Laurel said, I'm all right. Louise said, you sound different. Laurel said she was in Crossfield. Louise said, where? Laurel said, it's on the way to you. I stopped. Louise said, are you staying? Laurel looked out the kitchen window. The yard was empty, pale with early frost. The barn doors were closed. The aspens at the edge of the pasture had dropped all their leaves now and stood like gray lines against the sky. She said, I think maybe I am. There was a pause. Louise said, because of somebody? Laurel thought about how to answer that honestly. She said, not the way you mean. But maybe yes. She said, he's a good man, Lou. He's just a good man. Louise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's enough. That's more than enough. The night everything shifted, Laurel didn't know anything had shifted until the next morning. It was mid-November, a Wednesday, and she'd been on the porch the way she always was after Wren was in bed, after the house went quiet. She'd pulled her coat tight, and she'd sat in the dark, and she'd whispered her prayers the way she always did, half thinking, half asking, her voice low enough that she'd always believed it disappeared before it got anywhere. She prayed for Wren first. She always prayed for Wren first. She asked for the usual things. Health, safety, the ordinary miracle of a child growing up undamaged. Then she prayed, which she hadn't done before in so many words, for this place, for this house and this land and the man who'd built his whole life around the work of it, who'd lost something devastating somewhere along the way, and had rebuilt himself out of routine and early mornings in the company of a bay mare. She said out loud, "Into the dark, into the stars," she said, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know if this is right, but it feels like the first right thing I've done in a very long time, and I don't want to ruin it. I just don't want to ruin it." She sat there a while longer. Then she went inside. She didn't know that the window at the front of the house was open 2 inches. She'd opened it herself that afternoon to air out the room she'd been cleaning, and she'd forgotten it. She didn't know that Malcolm had been awake since 10, staring at the ceiling the way he always was when something was working through him. She didn't know that he'd heard every word. In the morning, he was already at the table when she came down. That was unusual. He was always out before she was up. He had his coffee. He had his hands around the mug. He looked up when she came in. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." She went to the stove. She started on breakfast the way she always did. He said, "I heard you last night." She stopped. She didn't turn around. She stood at the stove with her hand on the cast iron handle, and she felt the blood in her face. He said, "Not, I wasn't listening on purpose. The window was open. I heard you." She turned around slowly. She looked at him. He was looking back at her, steady, the way he always was. The way she'd come to understand wasn't coldness, but care rationed out slowly because he'd learned that spending it too fast was dangerous. He said, "You're not going to ruin it." She didn't say anything. He said, "What you said last night, about not wanting to ruin it, you're not going to. You couldn't. I want you to know that." She gripped the cast iron handle. She said, "Malcolm." He said, "I know. We don't have to make it into something. I just wanted you to know." He finished his coffee. He put the mug in the sink. He put on his coat and his hat, and he went out the door and across the yard to the barn, the same as every morning. Laurel stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she made breakfast. Winter came in hard that year. The coldest January Crossfield had seen in a decade, according to Bev at the gas station, who told Laurel this when she stopped in for milk and windshield washer fluid in mid-January. Bev said, "You're still at Malcolm's place then." It wasn't quite a question. Laurel said yes. Bev looked at her the same way she had that first day, the up-and-down look, but this time there was something warmer in it. She said, "He's a good man." Closed up as a clam, but good. His wife passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer. They'd been married 12 years. Laurel said, "I'm sorry." Bev said, "He hasn't had much company since." "Not real company," Laurel said. "I think he's doing all right." Bev said, "Yeah, I think maybe he is." Things changed slowly after the morning in the kitchen. That was the nature of it. Not a sudden thing. Not a declaration or a decision. Just a gradual turning, like the way the light changes in the late afternoon. So slowly you can't see it happening, and then suddenly it's evening. He started sitting in the kitchen after supper sometimes, instead of going straight to the living room with his book. He'd sit at the table with his tea, and she'd sit across from him with hers, and they'd talk, or not talk, and both were equally easy. He told her about the ranch, about what it had been when his parents ran it, about his plans for expanding the herd. She told him about Halifax, about the water and the fog and the particular gray of the Atlantic in November. She told him about growing up, about her grandmother in Cape Breton, about the prayer habit she'd lost and recently found again. He listened the way he did everything, steadily, without rushing her, giving her room. One evening in February he said, "I'd like Wren to be able to ride, if you're all right with it. In the spring, when the ground's soft." Laurel said, "She'd love that." He said, "She's not afraid. I've noticed she's not afraid." Laurel said, "She takes after somebody." He looked at her across the table. He said, "I'm not sure that's true. I was afraid when you first came. I was afraid you'd leave." She said, "You didn't show it." He said, "No, but it was there." She looked at him. This man who'd rearranged the world quietly, without being asked, who'd left notes and $20 bills under sugar bowls, and stooked the wood stove before dawn, who'd shown her daughter how to hold her hand out flat for a horse, who'd lain awake in the dark and listened to a woman he barely knew pray into the Alberta night, and had decided, quietly, privately, that she should know she wasn't going to ruin anything. She said, "I'm not leaving." He said, "I know." The garlic came up in July, green tips through the dark soil, dozens of them, bright and definite, a whole row of them, saying here, "Look, this happened, this is real." Laurel stood at the edge of the garden and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd forgotten it was tight. Wren came running from the direction of the barn and grabbed her hand and said, "The garlic's coming up." Malcolm said, "Look at the garlic." Laurel said, "I see it." Wren said, "Malcolm said you planted it when it was cold." Laurel said, "October, before the ground froze." Wren said, "How did you know it would grow?" Laurel looked at the green tips in the dark soil. She thought about October, the suitcase held shut with a belt, the $14, the cough that wouldn't quit. She thought about a note on the kitchen table and a $20 bill under a sugar bowl. She thought about a window left open by accident on a November night. She said, I didn't know for sure. I just decided to believe it would. Malcolm proposed in August by the garden, which seemed right. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't built for speeches. He just said, I've been thinking that I'd like this to be permanent, if that's something you'd want. Laurel said, I planted garlic here in October. He said, I know. She said, I think I'd already decided it was going to be permanent. He said, I know that too. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, the kind she hadn't heard herself make in so long it felt like something returning. He smiled, which was a thing he did rarely enough that it still caught her off guard. They were married in September at the Crossfield United Church, a small service, Bev from the gas station, and her husband in the front row, a few of Malcolm's neighboring ranchers, Laurel's cousin Louise, who'd driven down from Red Deer with her kids. Wren wore a dress that was too fancy for her taste and spent most of the reception trying to escape it. That night, after the guests had gone, after Wren had been carried to bed still in her too fancy dress, Laurel stood on the porch in the dark. She looked at the stars, thick and closed the way they always were out here, so many of them it still didn't seem real. She didn't pray that night. She didn't need to. She just stood there and breathed the cold September air and felt the ground solid under her feet and thought, this is it. This is the thing I couldn't name. This is what I was asking for. Behind her, the door opened. Malcolm came out and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with her, looking at the same sky. The land stretched out dark and quiet in every direction. The horses were settled in the barn. The garlic was cured and hanging in the cold cellar. Wren was asleep inside, 4 years old and already unafraid of horses, already claiming this place as her own. It wasn't the life Laurel had planned. It was better than anything she'd thought to plan for, and it had been here all along, waiting, not for her specifically maybe, but for someone willing to stop, to stay, to plant something in the cold ground and trust that it would grow.